The setting was a sprawling, neon-drenched metropolis in the heart of the Middle East, a city where the modern world's contradictions collide with the brutal realities of the old. It was supposed to be a night of luxury for the dozens of international diplomats, high-ranking executives, and aid workers residing in the city's most prestigious, heavily fortified hotel. But in the space of 3 minutes, the lobby was transformed into a slaughterhouse. 40 insurgents, highly organized, battle-hardened, and wielding assault rifles and suicide vests, had stormed the complex with an efficiency that suggested months of reconnaissance. They were no longer just holding the hotel. They had turned it into a fortress, with over 50 hostages huddled in the central ballroom, waiting for the executioners to start the countdown. Just 3 miles away, the US military maintained a massive, state-of-the-art forward operating base. It was a fortress of its own, housing 200 elite US Marines and Army Rangers. They were the tip of the spear, equipped with everything the Pentagon's multi-billion-dollar budget could provide. They had MRAP armored vehicles that could shrug off roadside bombs, AH-64 Apache gunships idling on the tarmac, and enough surveillance drones to track a cockroach across the desert floor. They were, according to the official brochures and the breathless briefings in Washington, the most lethal, most prepared, and most responsive force in the history of human conflict. But as the first screams echoed from the hotel and the insurgents began broadcasting their demands to the international press, the American military machine didn't roar into action. It stuttered. It froze. It succumbed to the terminal velocity of its own bureaucracy. Inside the US command tent, the air was thick not with the scent of cordite and adrenaline, but with the stale, stifling odor of red tape. The US commanding officer, a man who had spent his career climbing the ladder of administrative excellence rather than the walls of insurgent strongholds, was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. By the rigid protocols of the Pentagon, he was forbidden from launching an unauthorized ground assault. He couldn't move his troops without a synchronization matrix that required sign-off from 4 different departments, a satellite-linked situational awareness report, and a 50-page risk assessment brief that would take hours to draft, let alone approve. The Americans were caught in a paralyzing feedback loop. Every time a junior officer suggested mounting up and driving the 3 miles to the hotel, they were shot down by the protocol argument. "We don't have the current ROE, Rules of Engagement, clearance," the command staff argued. "We don't have the drone coverage to confirm the target density inside the ballroom. We need a green light from the regional command in Qatar. We need a legal review of the potential collateral damage." They had 200 men who were chomping at the bit, men whose entire training was built around the philosophy of immediate action. But those men were sitting on their hands, polishing their boots, and watching the live feed of the hotel on a massive high-definition screen. They were paralyzed by the very system that claimed to make them superior. They were waiting for a digital green light from a bureaucratic chain of command that was more concerned with a potential congressional inquiry than with the 50 lives currently hanging in the balance. The Americans had become victims of their own technological obsession. They had become so addicted to the information dominance provided by their drones and satellite feeds that they were effectively blind without them. If the drone feed wasn't up, if the encryption wasn't verified, if the satellite connection wasn't locked, they couldn't see the battlefield.
And because they couldn't see it through the lens of a camera, they couldn't conceive of moving into it. They had traded their tactical instinct for an administrative comfort zone. They were the world's most expensive, most heavy, and most technologically burdened force. And at the moment when they were needed most, they were nothing more than spectators to a murder. As the second hour ticked by, the insurgents inside the hotel grew bolder. They began broadcasting the names of the hostages, their voices chillingly calm, their threats growing increasingly specific. The Americans back at the base watched the feed in agonizing, impotent silence. The general's aides were busy typing up memos and drafting press statements to cover their potential liability, while the Marines in the barracks were listening to the sounds of the terror through their own radio intercepts. They knew exactly where the enemy was. They knew exactly how many there were. They were sitting on thousands of horsepower and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and they were forbidden from firing a single shot because someone hadn't filled out the right form in the right order. It was an absolute, humiliating paralysis. The image of the American military, a force that had projected power into every corner of the globe, was being dismantled by a handful of men with outdated rifles and a better grasp of the terrain. The Yankee way of war, the way of the massive logistical tail and the rigid, centralized command structure, was failing in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. They were waiting for permission to do what they were trained to do, and in doing so they were proving that the largest, most technologically advanced army in the world was, in reality, a paper tiger. How is it possible that a force of 200 elite soldiers, sitting minutes away from a massacre, could be reduced to waiting for paperwork while people die? Is the American military's obsession with force protection and procedural compliance actually creating a culture that is afraid to act without an administrative safety net? Is the modern elite operator just a well-funded civil servant in camouflage? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Does the US military's rigid adherence to protocol and its paralyzing reliance on top-down decision-making make them fundamentally incapable of handling modern, high-speed crises? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the story isn't over. While the 200 Americans were waiting for the gold-plated permission to engage, someone else, someone who didn't care about the risk assessment forms, the legal reviews, or the career-ending fallout, was already moving into the dark. Two men, no armor, no drones, no backup, were about to show the world exactly what professionalism looks like when you stop asking for permission and start doing the job. You're not going to want to miss the reality check that the Pentagon is still trying to scrub from its official records. Stay tuned. 2 hours had vanished into the abyss of military incompetence. Inside the American command bunker, the air was heavy with the stench of lukewarm coffee and the frantic, hollow clicking of keyboards. The scene was a surreal display of technological impotence. 200 of the finest, most lethal soldiers in the world, Marines, Rangers, and support elements, were effectively neutered by a chain of command that viewed the world through the lens of liability rather than opportunity. General Vance, the man supposedly holding the reins of the entire operation, was a textbook example of the modern manager general. He wasn't looking at the hotel. He was looking at a PowerPoint deck.
He wasn't assessing the tactical reality of the situation. He was assessing the potential for a career-ending media scandal. His primary concern wasn't the 50 hostages whose lives were ticking away in the ballroom. It was the Interagency Coordination Protocol and the Rules of Engagement, ROE, matrix.
"We need the Predator feed to verify the insurgent count in the lobby," Vance barked, his voice straining with the effort of trying to justify his inaction. "We don't move a single MRAP until the UAV provides visual confirmation. If we breach without a clear line-of-sight analysis, we're violating the coalition guidelines. Do you have any idea what that looks like in the morning news cycle?" The staff officers, a collection of mid-level desk warriors whose tactical experience was largely confined to simulations, scurried to comply. They scrambled to retask a multi-million-dollar drone that was already stretched thin across the region. They were burning through thousands of dollars in fuel and satellite bandwidth just to confirm what everyone in the room already knew: that the hotel was being held. The hostages were terrified, and the clock was reaching the point of no return. The insanity of the situation was compounded by the sheer, bloated extravagance of their response. While the hostages were praying for their lives, the Americans were busy assembling a joint task force that included a liaison for the State Department, a legal advisor to review the legality of the breach, and a logistics coordinator to manage the refueling of the extraction helicopters. It was an exercise in pure administrative theater. They were creating a bureaucratic wall to hide behind, terrified of the responsibility that comes with command. "We need air cover," a young major pleaded, his voice cracking with the strain of watching the live feed. "The insurgents are setting up firing positions on the balconies."
"If we can get a low-altitude pass from a gunship to suppress the upper levels, the ground team can get to the entrance."
"Negative," Vance snapped back, his eyes glued to a dashboard of useless data. "The regional command has declared an air exclusion zone due to the density of the civilian population. Any gunship activity requires a signatory override from the Pentagon's legal office. We don't have the time to push that request through the system. We wait for the ground-based coordination packet to be finalized." The gold-plated armor of the US military had become its coffin. They had MRAP vehicles that were practically invulnerable to anything short of a direct tank round, but they wouldn't use them because the risk assessment hadn't been stamped by the regional director. They had 200 men who were physically vibrating with the desire to act, but they were being held back by a leash of paperwork that stretched 3,000 miles to Washington. The technological dependence was staggering. Every time the Americans considered a move, they hit a tech wall. Need to know the layout of the rooms? Wait for the high-res floor plan to download from the secure cloud. Need to know the enemy's exact position? Wait for the thermal sensor on the drone to stabilize. They had become so reliant on these crutches that when the system encountered a moment of friction, they simply stopped. They had replaced the warrior's intuition with a software interface. Meanwhile, the hostages were hearing the insurgents prepare their equipment. The terror was real, human, and escalating, while the American command center was preoccupied with the potential for collateral damage in a high-density urban environment. It was a masterclass in how to fail a mission while pretending to be the most prepared entity on the planet. They were drowning in data, but starving for action. They were paralyzed by their own resources.
The most embarrassing part wasn't that they couldn't act. It was that they didn't want to. They were terrified of the what if. What if they moved and an MRAP hit a pothole and tipped over? What if they breached and the fire suppression system failed? What if a stray bullet hit a diplomat? By obsessing over every possible what if, they were ensuring the worst-case scenario: the slaughter of the hostages. It's the dark irony of the modern military-industrial complex. We have spent trillions of dollars building an army that is so precise, so protected, and so legally cautious that it has become essentially too big to fight. We've built a system that treats war like a corporate audit, and in the face of 40 men with old AKs and a burning hatred, that system was proving to be a joke. Is this the future of our elite forces? Are we really paying billions of dollars to have an army that can't save a room full of people because it hasn't filed the right insurance paperwork? Is the reliance on tech and risk management turning our most dangerous soldiers into the most hesitant ones? Leave your comments below. Are we watching the decline of a superpower that has forgotten how to take a risk? Or is this just the unavoidable cost of modern warfare? Subscribe and hit the bell, because we're about to pivot away from this administrative disaster and head to the street. While the generals are still staring at their screens, two men in street clothes are already ignoring the orders and moving toward the hotel. They don't have a drone. They don't have a risk assessment form, and they certainly don't have permission. But they have the one thing that General Vance lacks: the guts to do what's right. Stay tuned, because the humiliation of the Yankee command is about to be absolute.
While the American headquarters was drowning in a cesspool of multi-million-dollar memos, encrypted delays, and bureaucratic hand-wringing, two men were leaning against the trunk of a battered rented sedan just 3 blocks away. To any observer, they looked like tourists who had taken a wrong turn into a war zone. Jeans, t-shirts, sneakers, and casual polos. But the bulge under their shirts and the weary, hyper-alert scanning of their eyes betrayed a reality that the American general could never fathom. They were SAS operators, officially on leave, though the term leave in the British Special Air Service is a flexible concept. To them, it just meant they weren't under a formal deployment order. One of them, a man whose hands were covered in the faint white scars of a decade's worth of close-quarters training, leaned into the sedan and pulled out a heavy canvas-lined bag. He unzipped it, revealing the modular components of 2 C8 carbines, the SAS signature. He snapped the upper and lower receivers together with the practiced muscle memory efficiency of a man who could do it in total darkness. Beside him, his partner did the same, his expression as calm as if they were assembling camping gear. They didn't need to consult a manual. They didn't need a satellite uplink, and they certainly didn't need a risk assessment matrix. They had 2 sets of eyes, 2 rifles, and the absolute terrifying clarity of purpose that only comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. Their comm suite was a single, low-frequency, short-range radio, a device that looked like a prop from the 1990s compared to the American gear. They tuned it to the local police channel and immediately picked up the frantic, garbled chatter coming from the US base. They heard General Vance's voice, shrill with the panic of a man who realized he was failing.
"We are tracking the objective. I repeat, we are tracking. Hold position, units. Maintain a 500-meter standoff. Do not engage until the drone verifies the hostiles are separated from the non-combatants. That is an order."
The SAS operator looked at his partner, a smirk playing on his lips. "Sounds like the Yanks are holding another board meeting, doesn't it? They're going to let those people die while they argue over the liability insurance," his partner replied, his voice devoid of anger, just a cold, pragmatic assessment of the facts. Suddenly, their radio crackled with a different signal, the American command channel. "To all coalition elements in the vicinity, this is base command. We have an active tactical situation at the Grand Hotel. Under no circumstances is any unauthorized unit to approach. We are managing the scene. Stand down. I repeat, stand down." The SAS operator reached out and switched the radio off. There was no debating the chain of command, no appealing to the regional authorities, and no waiting for the cavalry. They knew exactly what the Americans were. A massive, rusted-out machine that had stopped working the moment the gears got a little sand in them. The Americans were waiting for permission to be heroes. The British were just waiting for a tactical opening. They didn't put on body armor. They didn't wear helmets. They knew that in a hotel full of hostages, speed was the only armor that mattered. They left the sedan, crossed the street in the shadows of the alleyways, and moved with a fluidity that was completely alien to the heavy, tactical stomp of the American Rangers. They weren't clearing sectors based on a map on a tablet. They were reading the building. They felt the rhythm of the hotel, heard the muffled shouts of the insurgents, and understood the layout not as a diagram, but as a living, breathing space. As they reached the rear service entrance, the American command radio, which they had flipped back on just to keep tabs on the failure, began screaming again.
"Base command to all units. We have reports of unauthorized activity in the sector. Stay clear. We are prepping the tank column for a deliberate, phased insertion in 60 minutes. 60 minutes!
60 minutes, the SAS operator muttered. In 60 minutes, the ballroom will be a morgue. He looked at his partner. "Shall we?" "After you," his partner replied, his finger resting lightly along the frame of his weapon. They weren't afraid of the suicide mission. They weren't afraid of the 40-2 odds. They had been bred in a culture that measured a soldier's worth by his ability to function when the world goes to hell. They knew that the general back at the base was worried about his career, while they were only worried about the people inside that building. They weren't bound by the rules of engagement that had effectively turned the US military into a bystander in its own theater of operations. They moved into the service corridor, the heavy steel door swinging shut behind them with a silent thud. They were two men in sneakers, walking into a hornet's nest that 200 Marines had been too careful to touch. They weren't just attacking a bunker. They were attacking the entire American concept of modern warfare. They were proving that all the drones, all the tanks, and all the billions of dollars of taxpayer money mean absolutely nothing if you don't have the audacity to walk through the door when the shooting starts.
How do you think this ends? Does the SAS pair survive the first hallway, or have they just walked into their own graves? Is it bravery, or is it just the pure, unadulterated, who dares wins philosophy that makes the British the most dangerous men in the room? Drop a comment below. Would you have risked your life to save strangers, or would you have waited for the official order from the base? Subscribe, hit that bell, and stay tuned, because the next block is where we turn the hotel into a masterclass of surgical violence. The Yanks are still drafting their plan, but the British are already inside. The ballroom is waiting. The interior of the hotel was a labyrinth of shadows and high-end mahogany, now scarred by the chaotic, amateurish gunfire of the insurgents. The SAS operators didn't move like the American Rangers, who relied on the heavy metal of their gear and the shock of their noise. Instead, the British duo moved like ripples in a pond, utterly silent, perfectly timed, and entirely lethal. They hit the service entrance with the fluidity of water. Their movement through the lower floors was not a raid, it was a clinic in violence. They didn't rely on flashbangs that could disorient the hostages or trigger a suicide vest. They relied on something far more dangerous: speed, accuracy, and the absolute elimination of the target before the enemy's synapses could even fire. The first contact occurred in the kitchen area. 3 insurgents were huddled over a radio, their backs turned to the doorway. The SAS lead operator didn't shout a warning. He didn't demand a surrender. He simply stepped into the room, his C8 carbine suppressed to a whisper. Thwip, 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 thwip. 5 rounds. 3 bodies dropped to the floor, their heads snapped back by the precise surgical placement of the projectiles. The bodies were lowered to the ground with a gentle, controlled motion, so that they didn't even make a sound when they hit the tiles. This was CQB, Close Quarters Battle, honed over decades in the killing house at Hereford. It wasn't about being tough or wearing the right plate carrier. It was about the economy of movement. Every step was calculated. Every arc of fire was pre-delineated. They moved through the hotel's service corridors like ghosts through a hallway, navigating the structural bottlenecks with a grace that made the American room-clearing tactics look like a drunkard's brawl. As they reached the second floor, the insurgents began to sense that something was wrong. There was no radio traffic, no shouts of "Contact!" from the sentries, and no heavy machinery rolling in from the street. There was just silence. And in that silence, their numbers were being harvested. The SAS operators worked in a coordinated leapfrog pattern. One man pushed while the other provided overwatch, their roles shifting with a telepathic understanding. They were killing one insurgent every 12 seconds. They were methodical. They were relentless. When they hit the third-floor stairwell, they encountered a heavy resistance point. 4 insurgents were dug in behind a barricade of overturned tables, their AKs pointed down the corridor.
An American unit would have called for a drone to soften the position. The British simply dropped to their knees, their shoulder stocks tucked tight, and engaged. They didn't spray the room with lead. They took single, aimed shots at the only part of the enemy they could see: the eyes. The insurgents' return fire was frantic and panicked, riddling the walls and ceilings with bullets. The SAS operators didn't flinch. They weren't fighting the fear. They were using the enemy's panic as a metronome. They waited for the insurgents to change magazines, the split second of vulnerability that every soldier fears, and in that heartbeat of silence, they surged. They breached the barricade with a violent, terrifying intensity.
The insurgents, who had been confident in their fortress, were suddenly facing two men who didn't seem to be human. They were hit with a barrage of point-blank aimed fire that wiped the room clean in under 4 seconds. The precision was so absolute that not a single piece of furniture in the room was hit, only the targets. They reached the ballroom corridor, the heart of the crisis. The SAS lead operator signaled a halt. He could hear the insurgents inside the ballroom screaming their demands to the press, the hostages sobbing in the background. He looked at his partner, his face a mask of ironclad focus. He didn't need to speak. He tapped his harness, signaling for the final assault. They didn't burst into the ballroom. They didn't scream, "SAS!" like a B-movie. They moved into the room through 2 different doors, flanking the insurgents from the inside out. The insurgents were looking at the main entrance, expecting the heavy American assault that the radio had been teasing. They weren't looking at their own rearguard. The chaos that followed was a masterclass in controlled violence. The SAS operators opened fire with a rhythm that was unmistakable. The precise, rhythmic pulses of a professional kill chain. Thwip, 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 thwip. One by one, the insurgents standing near the hostages were dropped. They didn't even have time to squeeze their triggers. The hostages were terrified, huddled together, until one of the operators stepped into the light, his rifle lowered to a low ready, his voice cold and commanding. "Get down! Keep your heads down!" The insurgents tried to pivot, but it was over. The SAS had already identified every combatant in the room. They weren't firing into the crowd. They were surgically picking off every man with a weapon, their rifles dancing from target to target. It was a 20-minute dance of death that ended with 40 insurgents either dead or neutralized, and not a single hostage scratched. The silence that returned to the ballroom was the sound of a miracle. The hostages looked up, staring at the 2 men in jeans and polos, men who had no armor, no support, and no permission to be there. The insurgents were broken. The fortress had been turned into a tomb for the men who held it. The SAS operators didn't wait for a thanks. They checked the room for secondary devices, secured the perimeter, and then did the one thing that the Americans never could. They started the evacuation. They knew that the general back at the base was likely already starting his armored convoy. They had just saved 50 lives, while the greatest army in the world was still filling out its risk assessment forms. Does this change how you look at the American overmatch doctrine? Is it time we stopped looking at the size of the tank and started looking at the quality of the soldier inside the jeans? Drop a comment below. This is the truth of the battlefield that the military-industrial complex hides from you. Subscribe, hit that bell, and stay tuned, because in the final block, the cavalry is about to arrive, only to find that the war is already over, and their only role is to stand there and look like the idiots they are. The Yanks are coming, and the look on their faces is going to be worth every second of this wait. The hotel lobby was still echoing with the ghost of the final exchange when the street outside finally began to tremble. It was the sound of bureaucratic vanity, the deep grinding roar of a dozen MRAP armored vehicles, their heavy tires crushing the pavement, followed by the percussive thrum of two Apache gunships circling low enough to rattle the windows of the entire district. General Vance had finally decided that the risk assessment was acceptable. He had waited until he was absolutely 100% certain that he wouldn't face a civilian lawsuit or a reprimand from his superiors.
He had spent 3 hours ensuring that every tactical box was ticked, every legal waiver signed, and every possible outcome projected onto a screen. He arrived with the full weight of the United States military at his back. 200 men, tens of millions of dollars in equipment, and the arrogance of a force that had been told it was invincible for 50 years. The armored column screeched to a halt in front of the Grand Hotel. The soldiers spilled out of the MRAPs, their weapons raised, their movements exaggerated and slow, their body armor thick enough to stop a mortar round. They looked like creatures from another planet, stiff, cumbersome, and terrified of their own shadow. The general strode toward the entrance, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm, ready to deliver the heroic speech he had practiced in the privacy of his command tent. He was expecting a siege. He was expecting the glory of a hard-fought room-to-room breach. But as the general pushed past the glass doors of the lobby, he stopped dead. The air in the hotel wasn't thick with the smoke of an ongoing firefight. It was strangely quiet. And then he saw them. Sitting on the edge of a marble planta near the ballroom entrance were 2 men. They looked like they had been dragged through a gravel pit. Their jeans were torn, their t-shirts were stained with dust and sweat, and their simple, rugged C8 carbines were slung carelessly across their laps. They weren't wearing helmets. They weren't wearing $40,000 optics. They were sitting there, drinking water from plastic bottles, looking for all the world like 2 guys taking a break from a long shift. Around them, the ballroom doors were wide open. 50 hostages, diplomats, businessmen, and aid workers were being led out by the local police, their faces etched with the shock of survival. And strewn across the floor of the ballroom, in a configuration that only a master of the CQB killing house would recognize, were the bodies of 40 insurgents. Each one had been neutralized with the exact same lethal efficiency: 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. The general's jaw literally hung open. He looked at the bodies. He looked at the hostages. And then he looked back at the 2 men in jeans. "What?" the general stammered, his voice failing him. "What is the meaning of this? We had a plan. We were the extraction force. Who authorized this entry?" The SAS operator, the one with the scarred knuckles, took a slow, deliberate sip of his water. He didn't stand up to salute. He didn't look impressed by the general's stars or the 200 Marines now swarming the lobby with their high-tech gear. He just looked at the general with an expression of profound, soul-weary boredom. "The extraction force arrived a bit late, General," the operator said, his British accent cutting through the heavy tension of the lobby like a blade. "We've finished the work. The site is secure. You can call off your tanks." The general's face turned a shade of purple that matched the bruise of his own ego. He looked at his own men, the elite Rangers, the lethal Marines, and saw them staring at the 2 men in jeans with a mix of awe and deep, stinging shame. The Americans had arrived with an entire logistical tale, a full suite of tactical support, and a budget that could have funded a small nation, only to find that 2 guys with basic rifles had already cleaned the clock of the most dangerous insurgency in the sector. You violated the command structure," the general shouted, though it sounded like a whine. "You had no authority to engage. This was a mission-critical operation for the US coalition."
The second SAS operator stood up, his sneakers squeaking on the marble floor. He walked past the general, not even bothering to make eye contact. Mission critical, eh? Seems the only thing critical was the survival of the people in that room. You lot were too busy counting your bullets and checking your radios to realize that war doesn't wait for your paperwork, General. You've got a lot of gear, mate, but you haven't got the first clue what to do with it. As the SAS duo walked out of the hotel and into the fading light of the desert dusk, the American soldiers didn't move. They just stood there, their expensive NVGs and heavy armor looking more like a costume party than a military force. They had the numbers, they had the money, and they had the authority. But the British had the result. The story was scrubbed within hours. The Pentagon's PR machine went into overdrive, framing the day as a collaborative effort where the US and the British worked in perfect harmony. They hid the truth about the two men in jeans. They hid the fact that the Americans hadn't fired a single shot until the hotel was already empty. They hid the fact that the greatest military force in human history had been publicly, definitively, and cruelly humbled by two men who didn't even have a radio that worked on the US frequency. But the truth leaked. It always does. It leaked in the veteran bars of Fort Bragg, in the clandestine whispers of the intelligence community, and in the after-action reports that get passed around like forbidden literature. It became the legend of the two-man army. This is the ultimate lesson of the modern battlefield. The military-industrial complex loves to sell you on the next generation of warfare. They want you to believe that if you just add another layer of tech, another billion in R&D, and another layer of bureaucratic control, you can make war safe, predictable, and clean. But war is none of those things. War is a human contest. It is a contest of will, of discipline, and of the ability to make a choice when the system tells you to stand down. The SAS proved that you don't win wars with hardware. You win them with the man who knows when to ignore the general. If you believe that the quality of the soldier is worth more than the budget of the unit, hit that subscribe button. We aren't just here to tell you the stories of the military. We're here to show you the truth about the men who fight them, the ones who don't wait for permission, the ones who don't need the shiny toys, and the ones who win when the greatest in the world are still filling out their forms. Drop a comment below. Do you think the US will ever break free from its systematic paralysis, or is it too far gone in the pursuit of the perfect platform? We're here to tell the truth, no matter who it upsets. Hit that bell and stay tuned, because the next mission we cover is even more unbelievable, and the Yanks aren't going to like it one bit. Stay sharp.